Good morning, and every time I forget I need to move this back. I'm Practical Christian Lessons, and we are going to be looking at Jacob Arminius, the Declaration of Sentiments. But first, we got to do a little bit of primer, which is why you are here today. We are going to be talking about, importantly, Jacob Arminius and his view of foreknowledge. This matters a lot for the Declaration of Sentiments. And I guess I'll go into this, can also be the intro into that. But first, if you're new here, I'm Joshua Pearsall. This is Practical Christian Lessons, and we do a lot of different stuff here. We do history, we do theology, we do apologetics, we do focus on living out scriptural holiness and the Christian life in general. We have a Discord linked in the doobly-doo below, where you can come and have those same types of conversations you could have here, where we'll encourage you to be in your Bible daily, to be praying daily, to be helping others, visiting the sick, things like that. That is an important part of the Christian life. And that's also part of our whole Means of Grace series that I highly recommend checking out. I think that's it, is the way of interest today. I don't have a lot of time at this exact moment, so I got to get this recorded and then get on the road. So if you don't know who Jacob Arminius is, I recommend checking out our playlist on the channel, Who is Jacob Arminius? For a more full, detailed description. But he was a very important theologian for, as I would say, I'm from the Arminian tradition in very large air quotes there. He came from the Reformed tradition and did die still a member of the Reformed tradition. He was never removed from the Reformed tradition. So important notes there. He was, as this biographer, Stephen Gunter's translation and commentary on the Declaration of Sentiments, one of the reasons I recommend this alongside, and I couldn't find my copy of it to have it, Jacob Arminius, Theologian of Grace by Thomas McCall. I feel like I'm getting the names wrong here. It was by Thomas McCall and Stephen Collins, I believe. And phenomenal work. I've gone over that on my channel. That's part of our very playlist on Jacob Arminius, Theologian of Grace. And then Carl Bangs, right here-ish, has a very, very good biography on Jacob Arminius. It's sort of one of still the foundational and go-to biographies I highly recommend. And Theologian of Grace does a very similar thing to this, where it's more about the theology of Jacob Arminius. It's not a complete biography. It doesn't go into every detail, but it explains part of his background. This does a very similar thing. It has a biography on Jacob Arminius and then goes specifically into a very, not a very close, but a much closer look into his time in Leipzig as a professor in the Reformed tradition. He was a professor, leading into his controversy that led to what is known as the Declaration of Sentiments. This was probably one of his more polemical and one of his largest apologetic works, defending himself. If you don't know what it is, he went before the Hague. This is in the Netherlands at the time. State and religion are the same thing. So when he's brought up on religious crimes, as some would say he was accused of, he then also has to go defend himself, not just religiously, but also legally. That's why he goes before the Hague, a legal institution, and then has to give this theological defense of himself. And he is, of course, found innocent and goes on for a little bit longer. But a very important part of that controversy leading up to this, and we're going to look into this here, is he is pronounced, what's the exact title here? The Rector Magnificus of the university. And that's a very important position in Leipzig at the time. And still today, if anyone has the equivalent of this position. He's the rector of the church, as he had been on the faculty only 2 years at this point. He gets appointed the rector. This also, unfortunately for him, he was already kind of being targeted because he was descending from the common Reformed views at the time, before the Reformed tradition at Dort kind of more narrowly, very narrowly defined what is acceptable in terms of their views of predestination. He was pushing against the grains already, especially against supralapsarianism, which was the most common view at his time. And in the midst of this, he is being accused of many false accusations, and there are people who literally go around defaming him and saying false statements. If you look up his 39, and we'll get through this in our readings of Jacob Arminius series, I believe it's 29 or 39 apologies, basically addressing different claims that were made about him, against him. And one of the, this was really funny, when some people are called out on and shown that they can't prove he said any of the things they're saying. Who is this man? Arminius wrote to Utin Bogart. I'm not a native to the language. He had said that God had revealed to Arminius that he had been corrected in his initial suspicions, which had been accusing Arminius of various heresies, basically. And Arminius responds. Arminius, much to his credit, handled a lot of this very well. He said, "Well done, worthy investigator of the truth, as if God, forsooth, grants his Holy Spirit at one prayer in such large bestowals as to impart the ability to judge in matters so great without any liability to error." He definitely had a healthy dose of sarcasm to many of his opponents, but he was not going around making false claims about his opponents. He was not constantly attacking them as was being done to him. And the amount of false accusations thrown at Jacob Arminius is extremely insane, because no one could get him condemned officially for what he was teaching, because he wasn't teaching anything that was really going at that time against Reformed theology. Post-war would be a different story. And in a very real way, he is not the same as the Remonstrants. The Remonstrants went a lot further than he did in a lot of areas, and that is why Dort had so many problems with the Remonstrants. That'll be its own episode another time. But the reason this matters is once he's appointed rector, these things start to amp up, and his opponents get even more intense in their attacks on him. And one of them includes when he gets as a student, Jonas Narcissus. And one of the accusations thrown against Arminius is that his teachings will corrupt the students that are under him. And this is someone who specifically came to Lindbergh and got Lindbergh and the Amsterdam ministers were accusing this, and specifically wanted to study under Jacob Arminius. So, of course, this is going to be the poster boy of, we need to get this man, we need to put him through a theological series of questions and tests, and our accusation, they thought, would be proven true because he will not be able to say things that are correct, and this will show that Jacob Arminius is teaching grave and dangerous errors. They were proven wrong. And I'm just going to read a little bit of this. Here we go. Several issues are at play in the interrogatory, but the crux issue is in question 3, namely, whatever, these are the sort of the questions asked to this Narcissus individual, whether whatsoever things come to pass contingently in respect of man, whether they also come to pass thus contingently in respect of providence and of the divine decree. This specifically is on foreknowledge. And one of the controversies of Jacob Arminius with his Reformed brothers was, how does foreknowledge work? And this debate still goes on today. The debate is, does God foreknowing something then mean he has by necessity known it, because he knows it is decreed, it is the act of God that has brought it into existence. Clearly, and the Reformed tradition recognizes this. They have their own answer to this. I'm not going to get into their answer to this. Taken at pure face value, if God simply knowing something means it must happen, that makes God the author of sin. That is clearly a problem. Various people have different answers to that question. I'm not going to get into that debate here. Jacob Arminius' answer, and this is his critique of the Reformed tradition, and I stand with his critique, even though acknowledging this is not the official teaching, and that's why Jacob Arminius did not leave the Reformed tradition, that there are those who, when holding this teaching, their answer is insufficient to avoid making God thus the author of evil and the author of sin, making him, in the most literal possible way, the chiefest of sinners. Because if he foreknows it, and that means it happens because he foreknew it, he therefore made it happen, he is the author of those actions. But again, not getting into the different answers, that's not how Reformed teach it, that's not their official teachings, I'm just putting that out here. Jacob Arminius' answer is holding to a form of middle knowledge. This is not the same way that Jacob Molina taught middle knowledge. It's not the same way as, say, William Lane Craig teaches middle knowledge, or many other various forms of middle knowledge are held. It is specifically the idea that God foreknows everything. He does absolutely have divine plans in place. The Lamb was slain before the beginning of time, for example. There are also things the Lord knows because they happened, rather than the Lord knows them because he made them happen. So this, and to anyone who would say that this destroys the sovereignty of God, I have addressed that point in looking through our playlist on this channel on Arminianism. That is a false critique. That does not stand true. To use a very easy example, with rebellion of sin, is a king any less sovereign because his citizens can and do rebel against him? No. Is the U.S. government any less of a legally binding institution upon me because I can go 75 miles in a 65 mile per hour zone? Absolutely not. There are consequences for actions. That does not change the fact that the government or institution, in this case, is still the ruling and sovereign authority. Do not look at the analogy too closely. They're analogies. They're not meant to be taken as completely literal to carry over. If you look too closely at an analogy, it's like looking too closely at a painting to where you are looking at the image within it rather than the painting itself. And that's sort of, not to avoid getting into all the philosophical terms, that's Arminius' answer to that, is that God foreknows and has foreordained many things. And then there are things God foreknows because they happened. And God, in his sovereignty, has allowed man this genuine free moral agency that is not impacted directly by his decisions. He did not necessarily make people, whether through secondary causes or whatever. We understand the importance of secondary causes and effects. I'm going to be a little sloppy in my language here. Doesn't mean it is because God ordained it or willed it. God has, in his extreme divine sovereignty as creator of the universe and master of reality, somehow made creation in such a way that he is still completely sovereign and has his plans that cannot be thwarted, and still allowed humans to have genuine choices that were not controlled by him incorporated into that plan. And again, the Reformed tradition has their own understanding of how that works out and has an answer. This is Jacob Arminius, and that's what we're going through. And this is going to be Stephen Gutter's commentary now. Even leaving open the issue whether the question was designed to be a trap, it was certainly a trickily worded question. It definitely was meant to be a trap. If a person's belief is contingent, then God's decree is dependent on man's choice and by definition cannot be absolute. And that is still the Reformed critique today. If God foreknowing does not mean he foreordained/forewilled something, that means God is contingent on man, therefore is reacting to man and is not in himself absolute necessity above all. I'm not going to get into that right now. Perhaps he conferred with Arminius, talking about Narcissus. Narcissus recognized the potential trap, and he answered with careful precision. I have to request, brethren, that seeing the word contingently is not to be found in the sacred volume, nor in the Belgic Confession, nor yet in the Palatine, the Heidelberg, Catechism, and is moreover used in a variety of senses by scholastic writers, you will submit to rest satisfied with this my confession. Nothing seems to pass by chance, but whatsoever things come to pass, whether of great accounts or small, whether good or bad, are subjected to the government and direction of divine providence. In such a manner, indeed, that those things which seem to us to be uncertain and to happen by chance, nevertheless, in respect of the most wise and omnipotent providence of God and his eternal decree, happen certainly and immutably, although of evil itself, which is committed, he is in no respect the author. Arminius had taught his student well. Narcissus' answer reminded the ministers that both the Belgic Confession and the Heidelberg Catechism were silent on the disputed issue of contingency, and Narcissus, with his shrewd response, was also able to avoid making God responsible for evil and the origin of sin. Neither Narcissus nor Arminius was served well in this entire affair. It only served to enhance suspicion about Arminius' heterodoxy, and Narcissus was not accepted as a pastor in Amsterdam. He later sided with the Remonstrants, but he served only very briefly as a minister, if ever at all, officially. And there's a whole historical thing to look at of the antagonism of the Remonstrants party and the Reformed tradition at the time, the institutions, the colleges, etc. To make a very long story short, two people in their opposition to each other, two groups in their opposition to each other, went to two very different extremes. Both had already made up their minds, such as like the Synod of Dort. The Remonstrants were guilty before they ever walked in the door. And there's a whole lot of things that were just done very poorly at Dort, regardless of your theological convictions. On the flip side, the Remonstrants also very much had their own long series of wrongs and sins in the entire controversy between the two parties. No one was without excuse in that entire thing. But long before that, as Jacob Arminius is teaching at Leidberg, as he is the rector, I don't know if he was ever declared a doctor in the Reformed tradition. I believe that was addressed in here, and I forgot what I read. I'll have to go back and through that. But he was never removed from the Reformed tradition. He was never removed from his teaching office, from his pastoral office. He was, in fact, raised higher and higher within the tradition, despite the actions of his opponents. Jacob Arminius clearly was doing something very right, despite his opposition. And if you want to know more about this, I recommend picking up the book. This was a very short and very, as you can tell, off-the-cuff video. Our Arminianism videos go into these same topics as well, and we probably will touch on them more. The reason I wanted to introduce that today is because that is going to be very important as we go through the Declaration of Sentiments, and we will be going through, it's underneath this Bible, Jacob Arminius's declaration from the translated from the Latin. The reason I recommend Stephen Gunter's, and I won't be reading it because it's not in the public domain, is he has translated it directly from the Dutch. So rather than a translation of a translation, which is what I'm reading, it is just a single time translated. But we will be going through the commentary that Stephen Gunter adds to the Declaration of Sentiments through this work. That is something I will be doing with this. I'm sorry I hit that. So please keep an eye on that. That'll be a change in how we're doing our Monday readings for a while. It will mean the Declaration of Sentiments will take a lot longer to go through than some of the other things we're going to be reading. And that is just because I'm going to be adding in the commentary. I'm going to have my own thoughts, but that's super important. This is arguably one of Jacob Arminius's most notable and most important works in a lot of the dialogues we're having. Not necessarily the most objectively important in and of itself, but it is very important in a lot of Reformed and Arminian dialogues. And that's why I'm going to have a lot of focus on it. That's where a lot of his critiques are really centered, and his more extreme language, because he also had to then, as I said at the beginning of this video, be giving a defense of himself in this. He was at risk of legal punishment, not just, losing his job and being removed from his pastoral office. There was a lot going on in this entire controversy. On top of, at this time, his health is in decline. This is shortly before Jacob Arminius' death from medical illness. And I think it was in some ways very sad for us that Jacob Arminius died. It would be very interesting to see what would happen if he had been around to be in charge of the Remonstrance movement. Would they have gone into some of the extreme errors they ended up falling into? Would they have reacted to what are known as the pamphlet wars the way they did? We'll never know. But it also means he did not have to be around to see everything that thus resulted, and he himself would have continued to be the result of just breaking of the Ten Commandments, false witness, bearing slander, libel against him, and those attacks would not have stopped. And with the death of really one of the few people keeping the peace within the institution between Arminius and his opponents, not to Arminius' fault, to his opponent's fault, to their sin, and their seek of disunity and controversy and wanting to bring falsehood because of really disagreement on an issue that shouldn't have ever raised it to this level. It's very, I think, in a lot of ways, very good and very bad that he did not live to see the results of everything that had come from that. But that's its own side conversation. I am sorry for everyone who wants a little bit of a shorter video on Mondays, but our Monday videos also tend to be a little longer. So you know what? I retract my apology. I hope this has been good. I hope this has been beneficial, and that through my scattered thoughts as I'm trying to rush through this morning, there is things that are edifying, things that are educational, things that will be good for you, and will hopefully be a good groundwork as we enter into this next big important work of Jacob Arminius. With that, you guys go in peace. Have a wonderful day, and God bless.